Hey, Paul, did you know that according to podcastinsights.com, as of January 2021, there are over 1.75 million podcasts, totaling more than 43 million episodes. And those numbers are just on Apple Podcasts. They don't include Spotify or Google Podcasts or other hosting sites. So it's easy to say that creating and posting a podcast has become a very popular way to communicate ideas.
Jason, did you know in 2005, the term podcast earned the title of New Word of the Year by the American Oxford Dictionary? Now it's been 16 years later, and you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who doesn't know what or has listened to a podcast.
Right. The question is no longer, hey, do you know what a podcast is? Rather, it has become, do you have a podcast? In May of 2010, Continuing Education Workforce Training launched CEWT Talk, our own podcast. And we have produced close to 100 episodes spanning over 3 seasons. We've learned a few things along the way, made a few mistakes, and we were thinking, maybe it's time we just share with people what we learned in hopes that they might get help and benefit them as well.
Yeah, in this CEWT Talk special series, a podcast about podcasting by podcasters, essentially is just that, sharing the lessons we have learned in hopes of someone getting benefits or help from our own podcast. This series will consist of 5 parts, and each part is focusing on answering one of the following questions. Why do a podcast? How to do a podcast? Who to do a podcast for? How to host your podcast, and what to do with that podcast once you have it existing.
So we hope that you enjoy this special series of CEWT Talk and that you will find some help in creating your own podcast. Be sure to check out additional episodes in this series and then let us know what you think. Let us know if you've had success, if it was helpful, or if we sent you down the wrong path. If you have any questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. And so with that all being said, it's time to get started with CEWT Talk. Hello, everyone. This is Jason Batalden, the Assistant Director here at Continuing Education Workforce Training. And Paul, how are you today?
Fine, Jason. How are you doing today?
Good. You know, Paul, I need to, we need to have an introduction. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Paul Dickey, the co-host of CEWT Talk. I think I don't give you enough credit in the intro, Paul. Number one, kind of like the hinge pin of the show, everything you touch every aspect of the show, and without you, the show would not be produced.
Wow.
And so I just want everyone out there to know that how much your work and your skill are essential in the show today.
Oh, well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. You know, it's so funny because, longtime listeners know that initially I was the behind the scenes guy mostly. And then when COVID hit, we kind of changed the format up because we went to the Zoom recording format. And I don't know, I was here just to make sure the sound was working okay. And then we started doing the whole, back and forth, on intros, and I just stayed on and asked questions. And to be perfectly honest with you, I really enjoy being, on this side rather than on the other side sometimes. Most times, it gives me a chance to hang out with you, number one, yeah. and also meet lots of interesting guests that we have on our show.
Right. You brought up an interesting point, though. Paul, I forget that this isn't the format we've always had. No, this isn't, and that is a great segue, because what Paul and I are going to talk about today, for lack of creativity for titles of a podcast episode, we're just simply going to say today's podcast is about what makes a podcast great.
Yeah. And what makes a podcast great?
That's it. That's his originals.
On our continuing series, of a podcast about podcasting by podcasters.
There you go.
Woo. So Jason and I were actually talking about what should be the next part. It's like, well, we don't want to ring our own bell, but what makes a podcast great? And it's not about what this podcast per se, but the other podcasts that we listen to. What is it that resonates with us on those podcasts that we choose to listen to? What works and what doesn't work?
Sure.
Because we all nowadays, I think, most people, if you listen to this, you listen to a podcast, and I'm sure we're not the only podcast you listen to.
Right.
And so what makes you listen to one and versus the other? And we all have our opinions, but I think Jason and I want to kind of break it down and going, what does resonate with us most of the time and what we think is a great podcast.
Well, it goes back to, right, we all have personal choices. Like my wife will listen to podcasts that will put me to sleep in 7.5 seconds, right? But she loves them. And there are podcasts that I listen to that she'll just, why do you even listen to that? So, I mean, we recognize that your personal definition of what makes a great podcast is entirely yours. And so we're not looking to argue, we're not looking for anyone to say, you guys are, but what we've have done, and Paul mentioned this, is we feel there are essentially 4 things that make or break a podcast as far as whether it's good quality. And so those are 4 things, at least, that we strive for on this show. And I think that was shaped and formed by our own personal podcast preferences. And so I think this will be kind of a fun discussion, which reminds me to say, look, this is episode 4 of our 5-part series on what Paul so eloquently and easily can say, a podcast about podcasting by podcasters. And if you have stuck through it with us through the previous 3 episodes, thank you. If you
thank you so much.
And if this is first time listening, please go back and listen to the first 3. So, Paul, let's talk about what makes a podcast great. The first thing we had checked here was format. And what do we mean by format?
Well, so our format, as if you listen to this special episode and you haven't listened to the regular episode, which I highly recommend that you do, our regular podcast format is typically a 20-minute conversation. Basically, we'll start, we'll say hello to each other, and then we'll introduce our guest, and then we'll have a 20-minute conversation with our guest. We actually have a keyword, welcome, that starts a timer. And so we actually, and then when the bell goes off, we'll politely wrap things up. We won't cut a person off, and then thank them for coming. So that's a format, and also 2 hosts.
Yeah. So compare that to, we have guests on a show. We have a structured begin time and end time. When you listen to CEWT Talk, you're going to know you're going to get about the same thing every time. You're going to get a little bit of banter, a little bit of introduction, and then into the conversation with the guest. And then it always ends with us sharing our information, our contact information, how to get a hold of us. The other types of podcast formats, and the big one other that I guess competes with having guests on the show would be that talking head format.
Right. And no, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, that's not to say that one is better than the other, but they do require, some different skills in order to make them great.
Right. To be, we talked about we're talking about what makes a podcast great, and it does kind of lean towards what your personal tastes are on subject matter. But as a person who listens to or tries to consume podcasts on the same subject from different podcasts, so they're different podcasts, but they're talking about the same subject, so they have varying formats. I can tell you that probably the format that kind of does not resonate with me at all is the single person talking about a subject. Not that maybe some other people enjoy that, but I find a single person talking about the subject, kind of boring. They might be the smartest person on that subject, but they're just talking. They're just talking. Definitely enjoy at least a couple persons, 2 people at the minimum. I actually listen to a couple podcasts that have make sure that they kind of have a group, so they have different voices throughout the entire thing. Not saying that, sometimes too many cooks spoil the soup, but, at least I think having more than one person hosting a podcast is beneficial. Or go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think you're right on, Paul. I think you're absolutely right on that. Now, let me give you Just a little different example, but I'm agreeing with you that having a co-host or at least two different voices is, in our opinion, the preferable podcast. For me, the exception would be where I agree would be where it's a storytelling type of podcast or like a documentary. Like, I don't want to throw out names here, but there's a particular podcast out there where one individual tells a story. It's like listening to a crime drama or a crime documentary, right? And she'll have interviews every now and then, or she'll have maybe people who she's recorded making comments about the true story she's telling. But she starts with the beginning, goes to a climax of the story, and then winds it down. And she's going to be the only voice you hear for about 95 to 96% of that podcast. However, that's a story, right?
Jason, you're absolutely right. Because there is one podcast that I listen to that is a story. Basically, they're telling rehashing stories, kind of creepy ones, which I kind of enjoy. But yeah. I think that's it. That you kind of get that campfire type of feeling, in my opinion, and that I think works when you. Hearing a story retold, a single person works great, but when it's a subject matter like books or movies or something else, I think having two people that talk about the subject works better. But stories, yeah, if you're going to do something where you're telling stories, a single person works very well.
Very well, but also requires a lot of work on that single person. It requires a lot of research, requires a lot of prep, requires a lot of you've got to prepare yourself. You're essentially doing a production. So generally speaking, we've given all essentially the exceptions. But if you are going to start a podcast, we strongly recommend that you at least go have a partner on the show with you, whether that be a co-host or whether that be a guest. So a co-host with guest, I think adds a unique dynamic, but for the most part, that's our preference, is not to use the talking head format.
Yeah, I definitely like to hear two different ideas when I'm listening to a podcast, or having a conversation. Two people together just having a conversation. It's really, it's on the surface, it sounds like, why would I want to listen to that? But sometimes it's these very personal moments that come out when you're listening to that conversation that you might never have known. For example, I was listening to a podcast, and this person was interviewing another person who was in film, and they came out with this story of something that I've never heard about them before ever. And you could tell that they were just giving you this information, and it was right off the cuff because he was having a conversation with the host, and he felt comfortable enough to share something that I don't think he's ever shared before. And I was like, that's really kind of neat because I'm there while he's sharing. Right. And so again, the multi-person thing I think works really well.
Right on. So I think we kind of established that's the format. And, from our own personal experience, we've even messed with our format. Obviously, when COVID hit, that was a major format change. But I remember our first podcast, we hit the 20-minute timer early on in the podcast, right? And we realized that wasn't fair to our guest. And so we don't hit the timer until we actually introduce the guest. And so that gave us more time and more opportunity for our guests to get involved. So, the format is adjustable to what works best for you. But I think if you really want a great podcast requires more than one person.
Yeah. Again, that conversation, that engagement really comes out. We all listen to podcasts with headphones typically. Unless you're at home, but most time you're listening to podcasts, and that connection there's no disconnect between the headphone and your ear, and it creates this intimate connection almost instantly, and having, that again, that shared conversation in your head. You think you're part, it gives you the feeling you're part of that conversation. And again, just listen to one sole person. Again, stories are great. And I have that rare occasion that you have someone who is super engaging, but most times I'd rather listen to a couple people having a conversation.
Well, great segue about the headphones, because that leads into what our second bullet point as far as what makes a podcast great, and that is production, and specifically quality. Sound.
Yeah, I think I mean, we did an equipment episode previously, but it does lead to what makes a podcast good or / great, is, so people will, let's use the example of a video. If you're watching a video and the picture's fuzzy or distorted slightly, but the sound's good, people will bear that distorted picture, and just hang in. However, if you go the opposite way, you got this crystal clear image, but that sound has this annoying buzzing or static, they will just tune out. Right. So, what you want to do is try to get that, that audio, so that, you think your audience can hear you properly. They can understand what you're saying, because it's with the headphones, you're listening to that on a very close, intimate level. And when you have a nice audio quality, your audience will engage, they'll stick with you, they'll become part of your show. They'll think they're part of your show, and that adds to the overall quality. Right. So again, you may have guessed that the audio quality might, because you can't control theirs. So you, on your side, try to control yours. And
I'll throw this out too. And I know we talked about this, in a previous podcast about equipment, but you don't have to go top of the line, top dollar, everything, but you do need to invest in recording equipment. If you're, especially if you're not going to have a video component to your podcast, you have to make sure that your sound is crystal clear and consistent. And that's hard to do. That is really hard to do. And it requires a little bit of investment, and it requires a little bit of, deciding what you want to do. A lot of people use USB mics. I get it. And there are some great quality USB mics out there. But if your system isn't capable of recording that sound consistently and managing that sound on the input side, on the output side, it just won't work for you. So, you invest, experiment. Unfortunately, you have to experiment a little bit with what works best for you. But sometimes using a recording device and a mixing device that records on a SD card, and then loading that SD card into your computer so you can edit, might be a better way to do it, using XLR mics or different mics like that. But if you have the right system, then make sure, that's all I got to say, is just make sure that you're taking the time to have the ability to capture the audio, so that when it's time to post the audio, to release the audio, that you're not losing any sound quality in that process.
Well, yeah, and that's important. Also, another thing that probably makes a podcast great, and again, is and we talked about this previously, is that consistent posting. The thing is, you've invited someone to listen to your podcast, they start enjoying your podcast, and one of the most disappointing thing is, your podcast is supposed to come out on your favorite podcast comes out on Mondays. Your favorite podcast comes out on Mondays. You're so looking forward to your podcast, because it's one of the things that you love to do on your commute to work, and that podcast didn't come out.
Yeah.
So, and and that's the thing is, I've experienced that myself, where, oh, the episode didn't post. Wonder why the episode didn't post. It says, I wish it was post, because I kind of scheduled this particular morning routine on listening to this episode. And now my day's shot because, because I can't listen to this episode that was supposed to post. So I know we had mentioned this before. So consistent, because your audience has expectations. They know what format you use. They know the audio quality that you have, and they know when you're supposed to post. And it's, because the thing is, if you can get people to listen to you, really, I mean, that's the best thing in the world. We're not talking about gigantic numbers. I'm not talking about big numbers, but if you have like let's talk about one person that consistently listens to your podcast. That's such a great thing, because they've decided to spend their time with you on a consistent basis. You should make the same commitment, going, hey, I'm going to, this is for you. This is for you. I'm making sure that this comes out, because again, that's what makes a podcast great, is reliability. Reliability. I know this is going to be out.
Right. And so those two things, format and production, are your opportunity to develop that relationship with your listener. And part of that relationship, or what is key and essential to that relationship, let me restate that. What is key and essential to that relationship is consistency. They are listening because they can count on you to give to them what they want. And that's it. You provide to them what they're looking for. And they'll trust you, and they'll listen to you. They'll support you, and you're doing the same, right? Because you're being honest with them and giving them what they want. So that's exactly a good point. And that kind of brings us to our third point in a weird way, because we've talked about format, not staying away. Talking head is a useful format, but not always the best shows come out of that. But if you're going to, and we strongly recommend you should have guests on your show, you got to have great guests. So what makes a great guest, Paul? Do you have an opinion on that?
Yes, well, you know me, I have an opinion. I definitely have an opinion. So I think what makes a great guest is someone who will share a little bit of themselves.
There you go.
People who have listened to the show know that guests can vary. Sometimes guests are less engaging than you would like them to be. And then you have other guests that surprise you and will share an intimate, personal moment with you. And you're surprised and taken aback, going, I didn't expect that. And the thing is, that what makes it nice is because they've shared something with you, and that the fact that they felt comfortable enough to share that with you. One of the most unique or surprising guests that we had was this young gentleman who basically fixes bikes for poor people or homeless people in our community. He puts bikes together and he gives them bikes as a way to get transportation for them. The gentleman walks in, and he's a very, he's a kind of rough looking guy with tattoos on his arms. And I didn't know what the show was about. This was when I was behind the scenes, and he comes in and he sits down, and it was about bikes. But then he told this story about this one guy, homeless guy that he saw, that was walking to work. And the guy didn't have a bike ready, but his shoes were all torn to pieces. He was hurting his feet walking, and he couldn't walk to work. And this guest told us the story about, he gave him the shoes off his feet.
Right.
And I was just so surprised and taken aback, because it was such a human moment. And the way he told it was like, well, why wouldn't anybody? And it's like, and I was just so moved by that. And again, so there's a guest who told us something, and maybe it wasn't personal per se, but it was just such a moment of realizing who they really were. And it was such a counterpoint to who I thought he was.
Well, and that's an authentic moment, right?
Yeah.
And part of getting that from guests, in other words, is giving them the freedom and the comfort level and the trust to allow people to be authentic on the show. And so, our show, our CEWT Talk show, there's usually a kind of a reason why we have the guests on the show to talk about maybe something specifically that they're doing, or what they're involved in, or how they are affecting the community. And so, that's kind of our always push, is to get guests on the show who are making a difference and allowing people, in the world in which they live. And, the greatest stories, the greatest episodes that I feel are when those guests trust us enough to be authentic on our show. And to do that, you have to prep them. You have to, this is, by the time a guest comes on our show on CEWT Talk, I would say there's been at least a half a dozen emails or conversations by the time that guest comes on the show. And the primary thing is telling people what your show's about, how the show works, and what you expect from them. And then, being and then honoring that commitment on the back end. And once that happens, people can be really super authentic. And that makes for a great show. So, it isn't about the popularity of the guest. I mean, don't get me wrong. I'll just toss this out here. I'd love to have Mike Rowe on CEWT Talk. You know what I mean? He's a big proponent of trades. He's a big proponent of, work. And that's what CEWT Talk's all about, right? Is giving people skills, or CEWT Talk. That's what continuing education workforce training is all about, is giving people skills that allow them to improve their life, to be successful, and to do things they love to do. And I just wish one of these days we get Mike Rowe on our show. Now, would that do great for our numbers? Oh yeah, it could be the worst show in the world, and you put Mike Rowe's name on it, and you're going to get a lot of listens. But the reality is, it doesn't have to be a big name. People want to hear true and authentic stories from other people.
Right. And, and we've had various guests on, and the level of authenticity or engagement kind of varies. But, when you get someone on the show, again, as Jason said, you want to prep them, let them know what to expect when they're on the show. But, once they're there, sometimes the level of their comfort varies. The biggest thing you can do to promote or to get a great show from someone is listen to them. So I know it's kind of a interview thing or conversation process, but what helps is when they're on our show and we actually listen to them as they talk. That allows us possibly to come up with a follow-up question or that will bring out some more of their personal stories, because sometimes they'll just talk about the business or the work, and you listen to them, and then you may come up with one key thing that they say that allow you to give a follow-up question that will let them finally open up. We've had guests on, right, Jason, where they start out very stiff and cold, but at some point, because we've been able to ask them, they'll just bloom. And all of a sudden they're on and they're now themselves. And that's a wonderful moment to see when or hear when you're on a podcast, is when they finally are comfortable enough to be themselves.
Right. And that kind of, and that segues into our final point, Paul, is topics. And topic is, you've talked about this, and I know it's true too, for myself, my own personal choices on podcasts, right? I'm going to listen to podcasts, discussions, or whatever it may be, on things that interest me. And my going back to this topic piece, and I mentioned this earlier, our show is committed to, having discussions with people who, are identified as making a difference in our community or providing opportunities for individuals to improve or to get, their lives. But that's a broad spectrum, but it's a specific focused topic. And, I think my argument here for those would be is you need to pick a topic that your podcast will discuss and stick to and stick with it. I mean, you're not going to get everyone to listen to your show. There's no way you can make a podcast that everyone will listen to, except unless you're Joe Rogan. I mean, Joe Rogan, I don't know. That guy's got a lot of listeners. But the reality is, you have to stick to a topic and be faithful to that topic, and make sure that your guests understand what they're there on the show to talk about.
Yeah, I think you're right, Jason. I mean, that's the hard part is when so here's the thing, maybe the topic exactly why you start a podcast because you're passionate about a certain subject matter, and you go, I want to talk about this, I want to share my thoughts and my feelings about this particular topic, and that's probably the best place to start, because if you're truly passionate about a particular subject, that will typically shine through in the podcast.
Right.
And so maybe that probably is the best place to start. Now, ours is a little different because it's about our community, and meeting people in our community who make a difference in our community. So the topic itself, the subject matter can vary greatly. The theme of the show is always the same, but the subject matter can vary great. Now, if I wanted to start a podcast tomorrow about overnight oats, then it's all in on overnight
oats, right?
Yeah,
right,
so.
right. But maybe the podcast itself would be how to better take care of yourself, right?
Yeah.
What are things you can do that can help and improve the quality of the way you live? Well, overnight oats for you is fantastic. So I don't want to like tone in on that. I think that's the more obvious point. But you've got to pick a theme that you want, and you have to stick with that theme. You have to stick with that theme. So.
Well, your listeners that came to you, they came for that type of content. They came for that type of content. That's why they came in the first place. And again, remember we talked about consistency and reliability. But staying, they're also looking for that particular subject matter that you started about. Now, here's the thing: is if you all go down the road and you go, I'd like to talk about this other part. Well, does it fit with your theme? Or maybe you want to do two podcasts,
Right.
and do a show on a totally different subject.
Well, let's use this particular series as an example. A podcast about podcasting by podcasters does not fit into our established CEWT Talk theme, or topic, or even format, right?
Right.
But so what we did was we established a separate series, named it differently, clearly stated, now, wait a minute, this is going to deviate from our usual format, but this is something we want to do because ultimately it fits into our general category of being a continuing education workforce training.
Right.
Is let's provide some of our knowledge, and maybe somebody could take what we got and even do it better. So I mean, that's just it is. But we never have deviated from the purpose and goal of CEWT Talk.
Also, this special series is not released on our regular podcast schedule. It is released on a separate schedule all itself.
And it's promoted differently too.
Yeah.
And that leads to the final thing. And this isn't necessarily, what we consider, what makes a podcast great. Format, production, guests, and topics. Those are the four things I think that if you really put your energy into, make sure you nail down, I think you're going to have a great podcast. The one thing that people always, even here at CEWT Talk. Well, how many people listen? What kind of numbers do you get?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Here's the thing. Our podcast is kind of a special niche because it is community based. So our community is southern Idaho, southeastern Idaho. And even though it might affect Idaho larger, but it's kind of a rarity that someone from out of the area might be interested in our subject matter in many cases. So we're not looking for gigantic numbers, and you shouldn't be either. If you're starting a podcast because you want to get 1 million, 100,000 listeners, that's not the reason to start a podcast.
No, and that's not an indication that you have a great podcast. You might have a popular podcast. You might have, you might personally have your own name, your own followers, your own, you might be the reason why people are listening, and that's okay. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have a great podcast. And so numbers are important. And we're like Netflix. We don't share our numbers. But on the flip side, you cannot let your numbers dictate whether or not your podcast is successful.
I'm sure out there's a podcast that has one listener that is probably amazing.
It's probably.
Probably. So, if you're doing your podcast and you're passionate about it and you're enjoying it, chances are that's coming through your overall content. And just because your numbers on your listeners might be low, don't use that as the scale whether your podcast is successful.
Correct.
It's the thing is that doing a podcast is about number one, engaging with the listeners that are there for you, getting out the message or sharing information that you want to share, and also number one, personal enjoyment and enrichment. So here's the thing. We started this podcast, 2.5 years ago, Jason?
Yeah.
May 2.5 years ago. And of course we started going, hey, we want to engage with the community a little better, let them be more aware of what we do and that we exist. And we've done the show now for 2.5 years. And really, to be perfectly honest, I don't think I would ever want to give it up.
No. And let's also just be candid. I mean, we are a business. We're school, we're in education. But the way, we have goals to achieve and be accountable to, right? How many students we bring in, how many people we can train, class. I mean, all of those different metrics that we use to determine whether or not we're doing our job here at Continuing Education Workforce Training. And I would say that our podcast up until this point has proven to be beneficial to achieving those goals. And I would argue that the minute that our boss, Gary, could determine that our podcast was detrimental to our goals, he would shut this puppy down no matter how much fun we're having with it. But that was, we established that in the beginning. And so our numbers, we don't have a tremendously huge following, but boy, I get surprised just about every week. Somebody comes up and says, "Oh, I really enjoyed that podcast." I'm like, "You listen to our show?" That's fantastic.
Yeah, well, and we had a gentleman from a different department at the university contact us to go ask us, "Hey, I have a conversation with you about podcasting because I want to start a podcast." And he says, I listened to your show and I really enjoyed it. And I like, he listened to the show. Listen to the show.
Dude, that's all I wanted to hear.
And we had a guest on once, and we were just scheduling them and go, "Oh, I listened to your show." Like, what? Okay. So yeah, we don't have great numbers, and again, it shouldn't be about numbers. It's about whether you're and we definitely have people out there that are getting to know our department because of the podcast. We get to meet people from our community because of the podcast. And again, people who listen seem to enjoy, and maybe that's the definition of a great podcast, is someone enjoying your podcast.
There you go. There you go. And that's cool. That's the point.
So, Jason, just to wrap things up, maybe I'm going to tell you two of my favorite podcasts.
All right.
That I think are great.
I didn't prep for this. So
I'm
going to have to go. I have to go off the cuff of my.
Okay. So I listened to a podcast called The Losers Club. They are reviewing every Stephen King book in chronological order. They are, I think, currently up to the Gunslinger Wastelands. No, wow. Wizard and Glass. They're up to Gunslinger Wizard and Glass, and all the other. One of my favorite podcasts is the Mac Cast. They do a weekly podcast about Mac and anything Apple related.
There you go.
And I enjoy that very, very much. And those are two of my favorite podcasts. Oh, third, bonus. Let's Not Meet. Creepy stories about people meeting creepy people.
Right on.
So, and that's an example of a single person telling single stories.
Right.
So three of my favorite podcasts.
All right. Well, I will. I'm a little nervous to share my own personal favorite podcast, Paul. Well, it's some insight, I share. So a podcast that I listen to every week is called the Dale Jr. Download. And it's Dale Earnhardt Jr.
Oh yeah, you mentioned this to me before.
And he's a NASCAR. He's retired NASCAR racer. He's the son of famous Hall of Fame NASCAR driver Dale Earnhardt, who tragically died in a racing accident.
Yes, I remember that.
Daytona. But what the whole premise of his show is that he brings on retired or maybe famous and maybe not so famous ex-drivers or other guests, and has a conversation with them, and their conversation is about how they became one of the best in their chosen field. And I love the stories. I love hearing stories about people, who, they just couldn't get, they barely got through high school, but they had a love for engines and motors and mechanicals. And they got a lucky break at the beginning, or they, and they worked hard for everything they got. And next thing you know, they're on a NASCAR driver, a NASCAR crew chief, a NASCAR, involved in the sport that they've had passion for all their lives. And I find great inspiration in that. I listened to one too called Criminal.
I'm aware of that one. I am aware of that one. Yes.
Yes. It's Patty Judge, right? Or Patsy Judge, Patty. Yeah.
I'm not sure.
Anyway, it's the same thing. She tells a great, and they're not horrible. Like, I don't do horror movies, so you start getting into gore and slashers and those types of things, I turn me off. She tells these great stories about people, and it's fantastic.
So doesn't she also sometimes add a little bit of like maybe the redemption story as well?
Oh gosh, yeah.
It's
a great, but it's 96% of her show is her talking. But she'll have like sound bites or other people that come in and offer, it's essentially watching or listening to a crime drama, a true crime drama.
Yeah, I actually listened to an episode where she had the woman who she kind of got caught up in this whole thing, and she was on the show telling little pieces as she was telling her story, and it was kind of engaging, because it definitely also told about this, because it was like it was like this woman got in too deep above her head before she knew it, and circumstances beyond her. It was really engaging.
It is. So those are just a couple that I listen to quite a lot more. I'm going to throw this last thing out, Paul, and then we want to think about wrapping this up.
Okay.
Paul would probably disagree with me on this, but this is my recommendation. So this is personal. This isn't CEWT's opinion. And Paul and I could probably spend the next 20 minutes arguing about this. If you do a podcast, you need to listen to your podcast, and you have to. I'm sorry, I played sports in high school, and Allen Iverson practice, practice, practice. And the only way you can benefit, I believe, get better at doing a podcast is listen to your own podcast and listen for the finer details. Listen to your voice, your pace, your inflection. Listen to, do you stumble over words? One of the things that I always like to do is if I'm listening to one of our podcasts, Paul, and all of a sudden I notice that I'm smiling, right? That I'm smiling.
What made you smile?
Right. What I'm smiling. Why am I? And that's okay. So I'm enjoying that. So that, I don't know. That's a personal thing. I'm not going to put that on our 4 bullet points, but I'm just going to say that if you're serious about doing a podcast, I strongly recommend that you are serious about listening to your own podcast.
Okay.
Learn.
Confession time. I've never listened to any of our episodes after we record them. And another gigantic confession is I'm out of the two of us, I'm the one who doesn't do any prep. And if you listen to our regular show, you probably go, oh, what does Paul even know what he's doing? So in many cases, so here's my bit of advice for a great podcast: at least have one of the hosts engaged constantly.
Well, I mean, and that's funny, Paul. I think that's interesting, right? That you don't listen to our podcast, but the bottom line, and I'm not dissing you or judging you. For me personally, I listen to every episode that we do. I try to listen before production date or publication date or posting date. But the bottom line is that, it allows me an opportunity to just make mental notes and just say, okay, next time I need to, and there you go.
Well, I must be doing okay, because I'm pretty sure I'm thick-skinned enough that you would, if you had any criticism of what I was doing as far as performance-wise, you would say something to me.
I would, Paul, and the fact that I never have is evidence of your skill. But anyway, I don't want to go down this road much farther.
Yes.
And I do want to just end this by saying, one of the things I think, and I'll say this not only as the producer, as the part of the production team of the podcast, but also as a listener of our podcast. One of the things, Paul, that I think has come evident out of our podcast is that there's a connection, a chemistry that you and I have that I appreciate, and I think our listeners do as well. So
well, and I've said this on our regular podcast many times. Gary Salazar, our director of our department, was very reluctant to start this podcast initially, and now I don't think he would ever give it up. In fact, one of his favorite things is to run into people in the community and say, "Would you like to be on a podcast?"
Right.
But I know that he himself has said to me that he really enjoys the way that we interact on the podcast.
Right. No.
I think that's, again, maybe that's part of what also makes a great podcast is does the chemistry of you should have 2 people and they should have some sort of chemistry together.
Right.
They should get along. Well, though I have heard some podcasts where people don't get along, and that can be entertaining too. But
that's fun too. Yeah.
But if people have chemistry together and they generally seem to appear to enjoy each other and enjoy the conversations they have, that also it makes your guest really comfortable. If they can see how you interact, and then when you introduce a guest, they feel a little more comfortable starting as well.
Right on. All right. So Paul, let's wrap this up. Just to hit the big things, format, production, guests, and topics. I think those are the 4 key elements to a successful podcast. If you disagree with me, please let me know. Please send us an email. Please reach out to us. Say, Jason, you couldn't be more wrong if you were standing on your head.
And if you don't think Jason and I have chemistry, let us know.
Right.
So you guys are horrible together.
So we're desperate for feedback. We don't care. We don't care if it's critical or positive. We want it all.
Yes.
So,
we want to engage. We want to hear what you think about our regular show, the special that we're having. Please reach out to us. And you can reach out to us at
cetrain@isu.edu. That's where you would email us. You could use cetrain@isu.edu. Call us 208-282-3372. Reach out to us on Facebook. Reach out to us on Insta. Let us know.
Yeah.
We'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I definitely, if one of you guys would send something to us, it would make my day. It would make my day.
It'd make my day. All right, Paul, that was a great episode. I got to tell you, in episode 5, we've got big surprises for episode 5.
Yes.
Big surprise, because we don't know what episode 5 is going to be yet.
No. Normally I don't prep, but I actually have an idea.
Okay. All right. Hey guys, thanks for listening. Paul, thank you.
Thank you so much, Jason. And again, thank you again, everyone, for listening.